In the biggest twist yet in the race to the White House, U.S. President Joe Biden has finally called it quits as the Democratic candidate. He won't stand for re-election, and he's named the Vice President Kamala Harris to lead the Democratic Party's ticket against Donald Trump. More details in our next report.
U.S. President Joe Biden has ended his faltering re-election bid. In a post on X, the 81-year-old said he would stay in his role as president and commander-in-chief until his term ends in January. "It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president," he said, while adding, "I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down." He also endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him as the party's candidate.
They just paid 24%. 25%, either one of those numbers.
There's been a wave of public and private pressure from Democratic lawmakers and party officials for him to quit after his shockingly poor performance in a televised debate last month against Donald Trump, his Republican rival.
If we finally beat Medicare.
It took the spotlight away from Trump's false statements and put it squarely on Biden's fitness for another 4-year term. All his donors began to revolt.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
Other gaffes at a NATO summit did not help either. He invoked Russian President Vladimir Putin's name when he meant Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and called Harris Vice President Trump.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president. When you get knocked down, you get back up.
Biden initially resisted pressure to step aside and sat down for rare television interviews. But polls showed Trump's lead in key battleground states widening, and Democrats began to fear a wipeout in the House and Senate. Just days ago, Biden was diagnosed with COVID-19.
Trump wanted to run against Biden.
Darrell West with the Brookings Institution says Biden's move creates problems for the Republicans, at least in the short term.
They're just going to have to recast the whole thrust of their campaign, which was saying Joe Biden was too old, he couldn't do the job, his family was corrupt. All that disappears now.
For his part, Trump told CNN on Sunday that he believed Harris would be easier to defeat in the November 5th election. It's unclear whether other senior Democrats might challenge Harris for the nomination or if the party would choose to open the field for nominations. Biden is the first sitting president to give up his party's nomination for re-election since President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And it leaves his replacement with less than 4 months to wage a campaign.
And for more on President Biden's exit and his endorsement of Kamala Harris, we spoke extensively to Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone. Do listen in.
Well, the more likely reason that they would be energized is simply because this is no longer an election between two very advanced in age white gentlemen. This is now a race, if Harris takes the top of the ticket on the Democratic side, but between a 59-year-old, half African-American or Jamaican-American, half South Asian or Indian-American woman who is a progressive from California, someone who has tackled the Senate and who has been a prosecutor and who has a lengthy record in public service. And then on the other hand, of course, the former reality TV star and former U.S. President Donald Trump, who has 34 felony counts against him and other cases that are still pending. So this changes the nature of the race, right? And it does stand to reason that you would get potentially more young people involved in the race. What I find interesting about the kinds of reactions we're seeing here in Washington is that you have a couple of different approaches. You have the approach that some have taken, like Elizabeth Warren, the progressive senator from Massachusetts, who has said, I endorse Kamala Harris, but who also is very open to having a spirited convention. You have Barack Obama, who you have talked about, the former sitting president, who did not endorse Kamala Harris and who is putting his trust instead in a more open approach, an open convention where you would have the delegates that were pledged to Biden potentially choosing to vote for someone else at the convention. And time again, as I've listened to people, some are endorsing, but it would open to other candidacies and some are not. But I do think that there is a perception that they have to be careful of because Harris was not at the top of the ticket when these delegates were assigned to Biden. And so the American public has not yet had and really won't have an ability to vote until November on a Harris ticket. In the primaries, they voted on a Biden-Harris ticket. And so that there is a concern about having the perception that there is enough democratic process going on in this election. Obviously, democratic rights and democracy, a big election issue, as Professor Oden has pointed out. So they need to be careful of having the perception that she is simply being coronated, or that any candidate is being coronated by the delegates as opposed to by the American people assigning those delegates. And that's something to be obviously very careful of. The other thing I would point out is that on the Republican side, you are seeing growing calls simply for Biden to step down and not even finish the rest of his term, saying that if you're not fit to serve and run as president, again, you are not fit to serve the rest of your term. And so you're going to see a lot more of that conversation as more congressmen and women and senators return to Washington this week for a number of hearings that will focus on the assassination attempt against the former president and the responsibilities around security. We're going to have a lot more people in town, a lot more voices at the table to talk about reacting to this unfolding news.